Welcome back, guests. Good morning, Mike. How are you today?
Never better, Jeff.
Never
Glad
better.
to glad to see you hosting in the big host chair this week. I think
Yeah, I finally clawed my way to the top of
fi-
this slippery
finally
pole.
a new era of respectability is descending upon the Hotel Pacifico pod with the gray eminence taking the
A new
lead.
era of respectability. Yeah. Well, it's the dog days of summer, and we're having day after day after day of sunshine, which I used to really enjoy. But these days, continuous sunshine makes me anxious for reasons that'll become more apparent as we talk to our guests. We've got what I think is going to be a fascinating show today that brings together award-winning journalism with theater and politics, all based on the single greatest climate disaster in BC history, which was not so long ago. And Before we dig into that, I just want to say we'll also be talking about some of the other interesting developments in the last week, of course, in our strategy suite with our guest strategist today, Fran Yanor, because Kate Hammer, our regular host, is back doing other things overseas and elsewhere that she does in her busy, busy life. But today's strategy suite, we'll probably be talking, I'm sure we'll be talking about pipeline politics, which are now back with a vengeance. We'll review the government's response to the Northern Gateway pipeline as it staggered out of the crypt where many people thought it had been interred. The fentanyl crisis, nearly 10 years old. Does the government have a new strategy since it canceled decriminalization and safer supply? They announced the opening of some beds for voluntary care in the last 7 to 10 days, but we haven't heard much else. And the session is over. Conservatives are getting mixed reviews from some of the people in the press gallery, and we'll debate why. So looking forward to that. But
And
in the
more,
meantime,
and more.
and more, yeah, probably lots more. We never
Probably
have enough
lots more.
time in Strategy Suite.
I
But
know.
anyway, down to business. On June 28th, we'll be marking the fourth anniversary of the 2021 heat dome that killed 619 people in the lower mainland in a single weekend. Then went on to trigger raging wildfires that wiped out the village of Lytton. And to put that death toll in perspective, it's about the equivalent of two jumbo jets crashing, killing all on board. Yet, who really remembers it now? Our guest today is Sean Holman. Sean is the Wayne Crooks Professor in Environmental and Climate Journalism at the University of Victoria. He's a Freedom of Information researcher and the founding editor of a pioneering online investigative political news service called The Public Eye. He's a former legislative reporter for 24 Hours in Vancouver and the Vancouver Sun. He's won multiple awards in his own right, and he's now, in addition to teaching at UVIC, he's running the Climate Disaster Project, an award-winning international teaching newsroom, and we'll ask him to explain what that is, that works with climate-impacted communities to document and investigate their stories to create a people's history of climate change. So welcome to Hotel Pacifico, Sean.
Oh, thank you so very much, Jeff. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Now,
Jeff,
now
you didn't put the trigger alert at the preface of the introduction. For political people of a certain vintage, Sean was a major presence, let's put it that way, in BC politics.
Well, to
Um,
say he was a burr under some people's saddle would be
Yeah.
an understatement. Sean,
Irritating,
A
a
major
burr under the
annoyance.
saddle, annoying, maddening.
Inconvenient.
You
I think,
could,
Sean, in one of the notes I read that you wrote about your own career, you kind of listed with pride a series of perp walks that you had forced on elected officials during. Do you want to just do the greatest hits that would bring back sore memories for lots of people?
Yeah, I mean, as many folks who are listening to this podcast will remember, I was an investigative journalist in British Columbia for 10 years. And over that time, my reporting triggered the resignations or firings of at least 8 different public or party officials, and also resulted in major changes to
were
law
they
and
bipartisan
policy.
firings
They
or
were
were they?
bipartisan
Yeah,
firings.
okay.
That's why I had to leave BC. Like, no friends on either side.
So those people all got to spend more time with their family.
That's right. They got to spend more time with their
Well,
families.
Sean, as I recall, your website was a must read because you were kind of breaking insider news on a daily basis, and you were doing it before online news really became a thing, right?
Yeah, Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I often think about what public eye would be now, with
Mhm.
the tools that we have now. Because by the time public eye shut down, crowdsource funding was only just beginning.
Mhm.
So I do wonder what public eye could have been if I had started a little bit later, but it was what it was.
Mhm.
And I hope that I did more good than harm over
It
the
still
10 years.
continues on as an archive online, does it
It
not? Or
does, although I
yeah.
think that archive is currently down.
Oh, okay.
We used movable type, which is now an archaic content management system. So I've
Mm.
been meaning to get it back up and running for a while, but it still does live on a little bit.
Mm. Yeah.
Mm. Well, and the niche that you created has been filled by others, but I won't get diverted onto that today. But I was thinking of one particular burr under many people's saddles who uses an enormous amount of FOI information and also uh, breaks a lot of news, but I don't know how many people he's sent to new careers. We'll have to check
He
into
who
that
shall not
before.
be named.
That's right. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna attract Bob McIntyre today if I can help it.
Timmy's versus Dunkin's. Hawkins versus Cheetos. The Oilers versus the Panthers. In these times of economic and geopolitical uncertainty, it feels like our choices are becoming more overt expressions of what makes us Canadian. While some telecom companies are reducing their Canadian investments and looking to the US market, TELUS is doubling down on its commitment to the true north, strong and free. How? Well, for starters, by making a $70 billion investment in network infrastructure and operations through 2029. $15 billion of that will happen right here in BC. These local investments include cutting-edge innovation and sustainable solutions like a new sovereign AI factory being built in Kamloops and the expansion of TELUS's Pure Fiber networks. And that's not all. TELUS is also breaking down interprovincial trade barriers and introducing real competition. They're disrupting long-standing duopolies by entering new markets in Ontario and Quebec. The disruption they've brought to the Canadian telecom market has contributed to a 10% decrease in home internet prices through increased competition, according to Statistics Canada. And TELUS remains a strong supporter of the CRTC's framework to increase national competition. We'll talk more about this and how TELUS is giving back to communities across Canada, including right here in BC, next week.
So Sean, you really innovated with Public Eye Online, and now you're doing something called the Climate Disaster Project, which is also very different from what our listeners might expect. Stories are not published in a newspaper, but they're transformed into theater in a documentary drama that's going to be released quite soon about this heat dome and Lytton. Can you tell us a little bit about the story you're telling here and why you're doing it and the way you're doing it? Just
Yeah,
tell a story about this so we get a picture for listeners and we'll get a taste of the work in a minute.
100%. So, as many listeners will remember, in 2021, we experienced a cascade of climate-influenced disasters. The heat wave that took so many lives across the province, the flooding of the Sumas Prairie, and of course, wildfires that resulted in the destruction of 90% of the buildings in Lytton, British Columbia. And the anniversary of those events is coming up. Um, but I think it's not just important to remember those events. It's also important to learn from those events. And it's important to remember those events in their entirety, not just the tragedy that happened, although that, of course, is important, but also the amazing communities that were created that help people across British Columbia survive climate change together. And as you know, the story of climate change has been a really difficult one to tell. It's been something that journalists have struggled with. It's been something that scientists have struggled with. It's been something that many people have struggled with since climate change burst onto the scene 50 years ago. And what I think part of the problem has been when it comes to communicating climate change is that oftentimes we've focused on the global environmental future consequences of a warming world rather than the present tense human local consequences of a warming world. And that's what those disasters were in 2021, the present tense local human consequences of climate change. And what happened during those disasters showed those consequences, but they also showed how we can survive these kinds of disasters together, how we can create a more equitable and just society in the future that's bonded by these events rather than fractured. So that's really what Eyes of the Beast is all about. It's not just about communicating climate change in a different way, although that's of course important. It's not just about memorializing these disasters, although that of course is also important. It's about figuring out what the future can look like and imagining a better future, not on the basis of what we would hope for, but what has already happened.
So this is very similar. It sounds very much like what John Valiant, BC author of Fire Weather, an award-winning book about the Fort McMurray fire, told us about that catastrophic event. That he found hope in the way that very diverse community pulled together and found a way through that avoided any loss of life. But we had a massive loss of life, and it went almost unnoticed in the case of the heat dome in Vancouver.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, Rebecca Solnit, who's quite a well-known author who wrote a book called Paradise Built in Hell, um, describes the fact that during disasters, oftentimes power is lost. And what that means is that during the night, you can see the stars that much more clearly. So, in a lot of ways, disaster can illuminate constellations of humanity, compassion, caring that we don't see in our day-to-day lives. And that is, of course, the story that Eyes of the Beast is going to be telling, that story of those constellations. But you're absolutely right, Geoff, that unlike the Fort McMurray wildfire, the heat dome that happened in 2021 is a disaster that has been comparatively unremarked. It's gone unremarked. And perhaps that's because so many of the people who passed away during that particular disaster did so isolated, did so alone, did
All by
so
themselves,
out
yeah.
of the public eye. And I think that's a tragedy, and that's where a play like Eyes of the Beast and where the work of the Climate Disaster Project as a whole can be so important. It helps show the things that we haven't seen. It helps us listen to people that we might not have listened to, and it helps us see for the first time what this experience of disaster is actually like. So often, when the news media reports on climate change and disasters, that experience is flattened because we have time and space considerations to worry about. We often focus on the worst of what happens rather than the full gradient of what happens. And so through our work, we really hope to show that full gradient and illuminate disasters like the heat wave that perhaps have not received the attention that
Well,
they so rightly deserve.
we can see fire, we can
Yeah,
see smoke, we can see destruction, and that's a fairly straightforward, connection for the population to see when that happens, like Lytton. We can't see the heat, you know.
no.
No.
So there's not What's the visual, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. 100%. And this is actually something that, as we all know, right, the news media has really struggled with. During a heat wave, what do you show? It looks like, so many people are enjoying themselves on the beach, right?
Mhm.
Or in swimming pools or with ice cream. How do you show something that you can't see? How do you show temperature? But I think you show temperature by listening to the lived experiences of people. You show
Mhm.
temperature by listening to what that was like for people who were most acutely affected by the
But
heat
but
wave.
in real time, I mean, just for our listeners, for
Yeah,
myself too, what does it look like? It looks like probably disproportionately lower income
that's right.
seniors in lower income housing generally.
That's
Not
right.
not not completely, I imagine, but is that kind of
Yeah,
the people
one.
that were most affected
Yeah,
or the
absolutely.
fatalities?
It's everyone who doesn't have the resources to be able to keep themselves cool. And
Yeah.
it's everyone who is vulnerable to that kind of heat. And so it's at that intersection that you found so much death during the heat wave of 2021. And that death just wasn't seen. It's homes that we can't see into, right? It's lives that we don't pay attention to. And it's so important to do that because even though climate change may have acutely impacted all of those individuals, it came for all of us that year in a lot of ways.
It was something that I'll never forget because I was working for John Horgan, and during the weekend, there'd been some preparation and awareness that it was going to be really hot. But when we got up in the morning on Monday morning, the initial reports were, it seemed to have been not too bad. Of course, there were people in emergency and so on. And it was only later in the day after those reassuring reports that the dimensions of the disaster became obvious and the discovery of so many people who had died by themselves, overheated and so on became apparent. And it led to a difficult scrum for Horgan where he operating from the earlier set of facts, made what appeared to be dismissive comments that he deeply regretted for the rest of his life that were just appeared tone deaf on
Mhm.
certainly, but nobody knew. And then suddenly Lytton burned to the ground, and that was the story. But let's get a taste of this, Sean. You've brought a clip where we hear from Lytton, a Lytton person. You can maybe tell us a bit about her and her story, which is one of the 30 different accounts I think you wove into the production that's opening on June the 18th at the Gold Court Theatre. So let's just tell us a bit about Tricia, and we'll play that clip.
Yeah, well, Trisha is a lovely human, like every single person that we work with, actually. Because if you listen closely to someone, as we do on a regular basis, everyone has a story to tell, and everyone, especially in disaster, has experienced something extraordinary. So Trisha, who actually has invited me to her home on a number of occasions up in Lytton, is now actually an elected official in the area, fighting on behalf of her constituents, standing up for her constituents. She owns a home that is just outside Lytton on a dirt road. That home burned down during the Lytton Creek fire in 2021, and then it was rebuilt in a fireproof way by her and her husband Don. So this was a extremely difficult experience for both of them, as you'll hear in this clip.
What a lot of people don't know about me is that my parents' house burnt down in 1961. A kerosene lamp exploded. I had three older brothers. They were 5, 4, and 3, and they died in that fire. I was born 6 weeks after that fire. I grew up knowing what fire can do. Somebody phoned and said they had seen smoke down by Hobo Hollow. And my husband drives school bus on a part-time basis. We got a call just after 5 asking if he would run up to Stein Valley School and grab a school bus, help evacuate the village. So that's when we realized how serious it was. We could see smoke across the village when we went down the hill. I dropped my husband off at Stein Valley School, realized that probably I couldn't be a lot of help. So I went to go back to the farm to try and see what I could do there. And as I came down the hill, I could see it looked like a grass fire, except that it was every building. You could see from Hopa Hollow up the reserve, and all the buildings were on fire. And the fire was headed this way, that it was jumping the river, and I had to turn around. And so I went back up towards the school and passed my husband. He couldn't get the bus in. It was too late to get the bus into the village to try and help. So we regrouped at the school, and there is a back way into where we live, and it's across the ridge. And we thought, okay, well, maybe we can get in the back way and do something, to try and save the animals. And as we tried to go up that road, the fire was already on the bridge. We couldn't get back in. Essentially, we were trapped on one side of the fire, and our farm was on the other, and there was absolutely nothing we could do.
And Tricia told that story to Gina Mortfield, who was a journalism student at the time at Toronto Metropolitan University. Like most of the people who are the interviewers and writers of these testimonies, they're young people who are working on the front lines of climate change. And as part of the training component of our newsroom, as part of the teaching component of our newsroom, we train them to work in a good way with people who have experienced this kind of traumatic event. How do you help someone, support someone in telling such a difficult story? And the need for that kind of storytelling is only going to increase in the future.
So, Sean, from an audience standpoint, if people are lucky enough to get tickets to the shows, there's on 4 different nights, I guess, June 18th to 22nd, and the audience will hear these testimonies and have a chance to respond to them themselves. And then you're going to have politicians present as well to give their response to the audience concerns. Can you tell us a bit how that might work?
Yeah, and this is really super important for us. If we think about the steps of trauma recovery, after restoring safety, you want to support the survivor in retelling their story. You want to support them in reconnecting with community, and you want them to be able to repair the harm, and support them in repairing the harm that was caused to them. And so you can think about what's going to happen at these performances in that way. We're going to retell the stories of climate disaster survivors across British Columbia. Then we're going to open up an opportunity for the community to reconnect with those survivors, draw them closer, share their own disaster experiences and what they think can be done to help survivors in the future. And then at the end of that audience sharing session, we'll have an elected official at each of the performances who will respond to what the audience said, respond to what happened in the play in an uninterrupted way for 10 to 15 minutes and in a nonpartisan way, because this is really a nonpartisan issue. Regardless of your feelings about climate change and what is causing climate change, most of us understand that the weather is changing, our climate is changing. There are more of these extreme events. And by having politicians show up to listen to these experiences and to listen to what audiences have to say, that's a form of repair, because it's elected officials who can do something about what is happening all around our province.
Can you mention who you've got lined up from the?
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna say.
absolutely. So we're still working on our complete slate of policy listeners, but coming to the performances will be Mike Klassen, a Vancouver City Councillor, Spencer Shander Herbert, Cabinet Minister. We'll be having Denise O'Connor, who is the Mayor mayor of Lytton, and we'll also be having Patty McCahonick, who is an area director in the Fraser Valley. So all of these people will be coming to listen to these lived experiences and offering their suggestions on the basis of what is in the plan, on the basis of what the audience has to say about what they think can be done about these events that are affecting all of us.
With increasingly intense summer heat and high winds, too many British Columbians have lived through the devastating impacts of wildfires. According to the BC Wildfire Service, 5 of the last 8 years have been record-setting years for the most hectares burned. More frequent extreme weather poses new challenges, and our sponsor, FortisBC, is evolving its wildfire mitigation practices to respond. That's where the Public Safety Power Shutoff PSPS program can be an option. FortisBC delivers electricity in the southern interior and knows that electricity infrastructure could be a source of wildfire ignitions, like when debris is blown into a power line during powerful, sustained windstorms when vegetation is tinder dry. So at a time where a single spark can lead to a catastrophic consequence, shutting down those power lines could make all the difference in the most extreme conditions. The option of proactively and temporarily shutting off power is a last resort to protect their customers. Nobody wants to be without power. FortisBC anticipates that this tool will be used rarely and only in exceptional circumstances, but it's important to have a well-defined plan in place well before an emergency situation arises. Wildfires are one reason customers could experience power outages at any time, and FortisBC encourages customers to always be prepared for outages. While this is a new tool for FortisBC, it's become increasingly common for electricity providers across North America. FortisBC is continuing to engage with their customers, stakeholders, and the public to ensure a balanced approach that prioritizes wildfire prevention and minimizes disruptions. For more information on wildfire safety practices, visit fortisbc.com/PSPS. FortisBC, energy for a better BC and a better podcast. Some of our listeners will hear me talk ad nauseum sometimes about the Fraser Canyon and Lytton because I've been up there a lot. It's a passion of mine. And I was there a few weeks ago and saw where things are at with the rebuild of Lytton right now, which is finally something is happening. Yeah, but one thing that strikes me talking to both friends who are Indigenous or non-Indigenous who live in the area is that fire has been a reality for them for generations, right? Forever. And it is dry up there at the best of times. And the town, in fact, has burnt down in the past. I'm not trying to lay track here to minimize what happened on June 30th, which was catastrophic. But more a question to you is like, did you pick up in those interviews a different way to contextualize fire from those communities that have experience with it? Did they see a difference now compared to what their experience has been in the past?
They do. I think the relationship between fire and those community members differs depending
Yeah.
upon the community member. I remember one of the survivors that we worked with saying that as a result of this experience, she's no longer afraid of fire. I remember another survivor talking about the aftermath of the fire, and he was right by a river, having lost everything, and having a moment of reflection and realizing that everything important was still with him. We've worked with another survivor who talked about the fact that now the smell of smoke triggers children, her children and grandchildren. So I think the experience, right, of fire in that community is really variable. And I think that's actually really important. because oftentimes we flatten disaster experience, right? We think we know what this is, right? We think we know on the basis of what we see in the movies. We think we know on the basis of what we see in news reports, and we don't. We don't at all, right? Fire and any disaster, right? And the experience of any disaster is multi-layered and complex. You talk to one fire survivor and they're going to tell you a completely different story from another fire survivor. We've done more than 300 of these testimonies across Canada and around the world, and I can't ever recall one testimony that was the same as the other. And I think that's why the story gathering is really so important, is because the experience of climate disaster is complex and we will not understand it. We will not truly know it unless we actually listen to that diversity.
Well, Sean, you did lots of coverage of people who, in politics, who were held to account for fiddling their expense account or something of that sort. And I certainly I felt on that day that I recounted when we realized that there'd been a heat dome,
Yeah.
that there would undoubtedly be a public inquiry. I thought, how could it possibly not meet the bar, even though there was no one who was, exactly culpable? A mass casualty like that would warrant some kind of an inquiry. And in fact, there was never a call for it. And I went back and checked my memory. The only thing that ever happened was the coroner service did a death review panel, a macabre name for a 24 to 36-hour process of experts throwing a bunch of ideas on the table, basically. I don't want to demean what they did, but that's where it is in the scale of 1 to 10 compared to a public inquiry. How do you square the magnitude of these events with the lack of coverage? You've worked in the politics as a reporter, and you're now doing this. What's going on here?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. And, immediately my mind goes to all of those other issue-based stories that I worked on that weren't related to political wrongdoing of one kind or another. One of the major investigations I did was about the lack of wildfire preparedness plans in British Columbia coming out of the Filman report, and whether or not the government had provided sufficient funding and support to individual communities to prepare those plans, and whether or not communities were actually acting on that recommendation in the Filman report. And what I found was there was a huge problem. And yes, that resulted in some additional funding on the part of the government to increase the take-up of these community wildfire protection plans, but clearly not enough. So I think, when it comes to these issue-based stories, it's much more complex to understand, right? In a lot of ways, right? There's not a goodie and a baddie, right? There's not direct wrongdoing, although sometimes there is. And I think when it comes to disasters, there's also a complexity in that we feel we can't do anything about it. We feel that it is the natural environment coming to violently visit the built environment. But the truth of the matter is that we can do things about it. We can better prepare for these disasters. We can even, over the long term, reduce the inevitable increase in the frequency and intensity of these kinds of disasters. But we need to think about that differently than we have in the past, not as an inevitability, but something that we can potentially have some degree of control over.
Based on your research and study on these issues, do you have any commentary where BC fits compared to other jurisdictions in terms of our readiness or our engagement with adaptation and resiliency?
Well, I think if you look at other jurisdictions around the world that have been more disaster prone in the past, we're not doing very well. But I think all jurisdictions are struggling to deal with this increase in extreme weather events. And I really worry about that at a political level. In the 1970s, there was what was then described as a crisis of confidence in democracy. Why did that crisis of confidence happen? The crisis of confidence happened because the idea was that the needs of the people were outstripping the capacity of government to deliver on those needs. Now, that crisis kind of went away as a result of neoconservatism and the idea that government wasn't actually the solution. Instead, it was the problem, and we shouldn't be looking to government for these things. But I think, and I suspect, what we're going to encounter in the future, and we're already there, is another crisis of confidence in democracy. And this crisis of confidence in democracy will be as a result of extreme weather events outstripping government's capacity to actually effectively respond to them. And that's why I think it's so incredibly important for the provincial government and for all jurisdictions to increase local capacity to deal with these disasters. And sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean money. It simply means being able to provide more support for creating community on the ground. Because one of the things that we hear from climate disaster survivors over and over again is A, the government's not coming to help, and B, it was my community that saved me.
The strange contradiction we face, though, at so many levels is that we've got wildfire scorching the prairies, thousands evacuated in the prairie provinces. Yesterday, Kelly Green, the emergency management minister in the BC government, put out a statistic that rocked me a bit, which was that 20% of, in two northern districts, 20% of the whole forest is burned down in the last 2 years. I mean, that only gives us another, few years of forest to burn down if we could be out of forest.
Yeah.
And yet we're debating how many pipelines to build, not whether there's a problem with fossil fuel production. And we have a leader of the Conservative Party who was thrown out of the BC Liberals or BC United, whichever phase it was, because he was denying climate change, and now he's leader of the opposition, and Kevin Falcon is in some kind of witness protection program. What do you think is happening to the public's mind about this? Is it simply that they're focused on affordability and that's trumped everything else, or what
Yeah,
is
I
it?
mean, I think it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Our needs in the present seem so much greater than our needs in the future. And because we have framed climate change as a future tense issue rather than a present tense issue, we think that can just be put off, right? It's not affecting us right now, when of course it really is. But I think there is some hope here. And I don't know about John Restad, but I do know that we have worked with a lot of people who don't believe the climate science. And what's interesting about the conversations that we have with them is that oftentimes they'll say something like this: I don't know whether or not this was climate change, but I do know that we're treating the environment poorly. And I do know that these kinds of events seem to be happening more frequently. And I think we've become locked in a trench war over causality. And I think the negative aspect of that, although causality is of course important, is that we are missing the fact that there is a much broader community out there, a much greater number of people who are worried about what is happening, who are concerned about what is happening in their communities. And I wish that we would talk more to those people, because I think it's those people who can make the change. And I think it's those people who want to make the change. So I believe that John Restad cares deeply about his community. I believe he cares deeply about this province. And I don't know this for a fact, but I would imagine he cares deeply about these disasters that are impacting British Columbians. So let's start with that, right? That's a lot of agreement. That's a lot of agreement. And I think we've had enough disagreement in politics.
Sean, we
Well, I
should give
don't
you an
think,
opportunity to plug your
yeah, exactly.
event again and let people know how to engage with that.
Absolutely. So, Eyes of the Beast will be at the Gold Corp Center for the Performing Arts later
Downtown
this month,
Vancouver, right?
downtown Vancouver.
Yeah.
It'll be performing from the 18th to the 22nd. There'll be evening performances at 7:30 and matinees on the 21st and 22nd at 2:30. And we would love to see you there.
And how do they get tickets? How do people get tickets?
Yeah, they can get tickets at New World Theater's website, which if you look up New World Theater, you can find it there. And I believe we're going to be posting the link to those tickets as part of this podcast.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, Sean, thanks so much for joining us today. And I think I told you when we talked earlier that I always believed it was one of the most underreported stories, in BC in my lifetime. So thank you for taking that up. But thank you also for trying to find a new way to tell these enormously complex stories that you simply aren't going to fit in 28 column inches or in a tweet.
No, the world needs a lot more complexity, right, than we can usually provide.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, both of you.
You might not think of them when you think of healthcare, but when you or someone you care about needs a definitive diagnosis, life-saving treatment, and help with recovery, you will. That's why this message from our new sponsor, the Health Sciences Association of British Columbia, is so important. They're BC's respiratory therapists, lab technologists, radiation therapists, physiotherapists, imaging technologists in sonography, MRI, and CT, and members of over 60 other specialized health professions. They're the critical links in a healthcare system that works, a system that saves lives. But for too many of them, just doing their job can be a fight for their own survival. Staying late, arriving early, working extra shift after extra shift, because BC's health science professionals are understaffed, overworked, and just not paid enough. And that has to change. And it can. With fair pay, we can end the shortages of BC's specialized healthcare professionals, because if we don't help them, they can't help us. Well, we're very pleased to be joined in the Strategy Suite today by Fran Yanor. And Fran is the founder and legislative journalist for Northern Beat, which you can find on Substack, via podcasts, and many other means. Fran, welcome to Hotel Pacifico. Before we get into Strategy Suite, why don't you tell us a bit about Northern Beat and what role you're trying to play with that very important publication?
Well, I was working as a legislative reporter in the press gallery, and what I noticed was there was not a lot of media covering communities outside of Vancouver and Victoria. And obviously public policy, if it affects Vancouver, it probably affects Kamloops and Kelowna. But and what I noticed in talking to mayors in rural areas and community leaders is they often didn't feel heard by the decision makers in Victoria. And we're very frustrated. Certainly the residents also very frustrated. And then in talking to the decision makers in Victoria, they also didn't always really have a good grasp of what the issues were in rural BC. And so I just saw it as an opportunity to be kind of a conduit. There's an issue in Campbell River. And, so then I could take it to the minister responsible. If it's like a hospital thing, go to the Minister of Health and say, hey, Campbell River's got this issue. What do you have to say about it? What should they be doing, And I got very positive feedback. The other thing is, I was also very concerned about the public dialogue at the time, very polarized, very adversarial on issues. And it seemed to me that it was on issues that were really complex. Like we have a lot of like Thomas Homer Dixon. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but the complexity of society and the complexity of our world. It's just not. We need breaking news. We need quick information, but we also need long form journalism. We need to have also some exploration that digs into the layers and the nuances of issues and tries to present it. I'm a bit of an old school journalist. I don't know how that happens suddenly, but and so I can be assertive with government, but I do try and present the complexity of it without being partisan. Yeah.
So to take an example right from the news, the pipeline debate, which never seems to end, has come back again in a new way as a result of the national concern about building up the economy, responding to Trump. What are you hearing in your constituencies, in your communities about the pipeline debate that might be different from what we're hearing downtown?
Well, a lot of the communities, the rural communities, rely on natural resource development, as I'm sure you know, having been chief of staff to a premier who did try and reach out to the rural communities. John Horgan was appreciated for that. So they're much more in favor, I would say, generally, because their livelihoods rely on it. I think Corky Evans, we did a profile on the great Corky Evans recently, and he said it, I thought, really well, which is he had some concerns with the direction that the NDP is going right now. And he said, I think they've forgotten that those of us out here in the rural areas, we rely on resource development for our jobs. And so that's what I hear is, of course, there's still people that are that don't want the pipelines, that don't want the projects, we're upset about the dam, for instance, Site C taking over so much agricultural land. Even people that are in favor of the dam up in the Northeast were upset about the dam taking over all that agricultural land. But they also need jobs. They need to be able to sustain their families. It's like First Nations communities. I mean, they need to have an economy, and a resource project is the surest way to do it, I guess, in terms of really high-paying, strong jobs. I mean, and you have some communities like the Haisla who have pulled it off.
Well,
so
first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we've had 2 Corky Evans references in the last 2 weeks here.
Oh, really?
On the Hotel Pacifico pod. So for those Gen Zs out there listening, please Wikipedia this. But on pipelines, like what I'm not sure about right now is whether this oil pipeline, I'll talk separate oil from gas here,
right?
Whether this oil pipeline debate is a performative exercise or whether this is real. Is this something that Danielle Smith has to advance to be seen by Alberta to be advancing, even if it's not likely to happen, or whether this is a substantive issue? That's a question mark in my mind right now.
See, now that's interesting. So you're talking about the oil pipeline sort of prospect raised last week.
Northern Gateway, yeah.
Or the one that they raised at the First Minister's Conference last week.
Yeah, basically, which is presumed to be that they would punch it via, the northern route, right?
Right. Which, but my perspective on that was maybe a little bit different in that I thought it was really interesting. We've just the EB government has just pushed through all this major projects legislation to speed everything up, fast track it so we can get those projects out there. The federal government's got legislation for the same. The first ministers all gather and they're brainstorming, it seems, and they're all coming up with major projects. Carney, our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has a list of 20 projects that sounds like he's thinking about. And then he says, obviously Danielle Smith is always in favor of getting her product, whether it's oil and gas, anywhere. And so she's in favor of this pipeline idea. Carney seems open to it. Even a couple of the other premiers supported it. And then of course, EB wasn't there. He was in Asia. So we didn't get a direct comment from the Premier, David Eby, because he's on a trade mission to Asia. But his stand-in, the Attorney General, Nikki Sharma, says, no debate. It's not even open for debate. We're not interested. So I thought, that's very interesting. Because even if they weren't interested in it, shouldn't they have been in the spirit of brainstorming? Not immediately shut down a major project idea that
I don't know, Geoff. It
actually...
seems like they've had a bunch of messages on it.
Yeah, that was my concern too, because I was listening to Fran and thinking about the various ways you could respond. I mean, I picked it up slightly differently, Fran, but same content, which was that David Eby's and Nikki Sharma's first reaction were kind of deflections to say, well, we don't have a proponent, we don't see any money, we don't know who's in charge, we don't have anything in front of us, which they could have been more categorical and said, well, on the one hand, if we see a proposal that's backed by capable people, we're obligated to take it seriously, but we're not very sympathetic. Everybody understands the background here in BC, but bring us something, we'll take a look at it. That would have been one way to go. Another way to go was the one they took, which is to say, no, we just are. And then they did take that position. They started to shift from this more deflection to, I thought, as you say, a direct rejection. And that finally came from Eby himself. So after a day or two of, well, we don't know who it is, there's no money, we don't have anything in front of us, they said, no, we're not in favor of it, which is also more consistent with some of the other politics that might emerge, say, with the tanker moratorium and some of the other practical stuff. A fourth way they could have gone, am I at 4 yet? Anyway, they could have said, hey, we're just commissioning a gas pipeline. We've already got permits on that pipeline to increase its capacity significantly, which would be about a $19 billion construction project. That's what it was 2 or 3 years ago anyway. And we've effectively greenlighted this other gas pipeline. So we're not anti-pipeline. There's going to be jobs here for more people than we have at the moment. That could have been another way to go. So, if this oil thing comes along, we'll cross our bridge.
Can we count all of our pipelines for a second?
I think we should, yeah.
Well, like since the NDP have come into power, actually, to put it that way, TMX has been commissioned.
Right.
So that's the oil pipeline to Westridge Terminals in Burnaby. And then Coastal GasLink is about to connect the gas. Well, it already has connected the gas to LNG Canada, and they're about to do their first shipment soon. Not sure when. Mid decade, I'm told, which is pretty close to now. And then we've got the news of last week, which is that the government has made a determination that the PRGT pipeline, which would feed the Nishka LNG project, has achieved substantial start, which means that they can continue on with their environmental assessment certificate that was gained in the past and don't have to go through that process all over again. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot of infrastructure that just that much in the last 7 or 8 years has happened. Now, where we go from here, I think, I don't think there'd be much difference between the way the NDP would look at it and the way the BC Liberals of yesterday would have looked at it, which is natural gas is the opportunity for BC economically, and oil is the opportunity for Alberta. And so there's difference in how the two provinces look at it in terms of what their interests are.
Right.
Well, Fran, is David Eby making...
These are supposed to be nation building project.
Well, correct. And that's what the Prime Minister comes in and says, well, how do we do everything?
I was just thinking that by dismissing it before it's even been discussed, whether they even intend to go there or not, by just dismissing it, they open themselves to some of the, I thought, the most concerning criticisms of Bill 14 and 15, which is, on what criteria will you be bypassing environmental assessments? And they've said it for wind, and they've said they're going to do it for other green energy. But for Bill 15, which is just approving major infrastructure, like even Von Promer, what did he say? It opens them to suspicions of political trading, and influence peddling, because we don't know. Brad West said, what does this mean? We're going to have more lobbyists. And if you have a great lobbyist, or the best, most connected lobbyist, then your project's going to get approved. And so when you have a government that just immediately, because they don't want anymore, say, no, we're not into it, it's like, I think you open yourself up.
You flagged for me that you recently interviewed Brad West on your podcast on Northern Beat, so I have to go back and listen to that
Yeah, it was good.
because he's not shy of things to say. Um,
And you'll hear about Corky Evans again, by the way.
oh, there, oh, triple,
Apparently,
triple,
he's a hero of Brad's.
triple reference. But yeah, no, to your point, I mean, yeah, these are nation building projects, and ideally all provinces support all provinces, but obviously the
Yeah.
incentives are much different between BC and Alberta in terms of what they want to get behind. And it's not to say both can't happen; they both could happen. And for the oil pipeline, I mean, mainly it's a federal deal. Um, Geoff, your government went through the exercise of trying to stop TMX, and ultimately the federal government prevailed over the objections of the province, over the objections of the Tsleil-Waututh and other First Nations along the route. So these things can get done with certain interests being opposed.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe we should go to 14 and 15, which are the bills that Fran's just mentioned, to explore a bit whether the issue is really environmental approval or whether it's Indigenous consent. Which is more high profile, Fran, in Northern commentary and discussion about these? Because we see two lines of discussion about Indigenous interests. One is that many are in favor of these projects. They're equity participants. That is the nature of their consent and their approval. Therefore, we're going ahead. And then very harsh criticism of David Eby and his government from the First Nations Leadership Council because there wasn't consultation. What's the dominant thread there? And is Eby winning in some respects because he's heard to be fighting for faster development? Is that working for him politically, even though the commentary is often negative?
I would say I haven't talked to anyone that isn't in favor of fast tracking projects.
Right.
Mayors, I've talked to a lot of mayors, a few chiefs. In terms of, was your question? Sorry, it was what is the
Well,
what's
I
more?
think people, yeah, what's the real rub here? Because most of the vocal opposition to Bill 14 and 15, or what I heard mostly was, as you say, it's not that he's fast tracking or even that he might skip a few environmental steps. The controversy has been that he went too fast as far as Indigenous people are concerned and Indigenous leadership without consultation. And then also concern that maybe Indigenous participants will be opposed and that will stop everything. I mean, what is the main anxiety that is being felt in northern communities around these bills? Because is it a democratic issue? Is it that it's too fast? Is it too slow? What do you think is really bugging people?
Yeah, I think it's the unilateral decision-making power they're giving to themselves. Like that's certainly from the municipalities. That's certainly from the First Nations. They didn't business community. We had an op-ed from the Cattlemen's Association president who was concerned about this busting through democracy. This idea that cabinet, the decisions will lie in the hands of cabinet. And I don't think anyone likes that. Even Leonard Krogh, who was one of the mayors that was not as opposed to the bill. Almost all of them were opposed and concerned about the unilateral sort of power that it gives cabinet. But the Krogh was a little bit more circumspect. He says, "Hey, we need to speed this stuff up. And if we're going to get investment, we have to show that we can actually get projects done in a reasonable timeline." And I did hear that from other mayors also. But Krogh also was like, as far as what we're opening the door to for future governments, like when you give yourself this power, then the next government, and as you both know, governments don't stay there forever. Like there's going to be another party one day, even if it's the same party. You got a different leader. It's very different, as we are seeing.
It's certainly not a great validation of their own permitting process that they have to bypass it with special powers. Well, let's
for
maybe
schools and hospitals.
Yeah,
maybe that's a good segue from dictatorial powers to involuntary care, Geoff.
Well, this was another announcement, Fran. I know it's also been hotly debated up north, but Josie Osborne now announcing some involuntary care beds are being opened, although in the Maple Ridge area. These are for people who have serious long-term damage as a result of drug use and maybe also mentally ill. They could be involved in lots of crime, and they would be against their will put in a treatment program. What are you hearing in your neck of the woods about the current situation with regard to the overdose crisis, or has it dropped off the radar since all of the rollbacks on harm reduction?
Not at all. It's might even be the number one issue if you had to pick one issue that was number one for mayors, and that's who I talk to a lot, because that's what they're hearing on the street. That's what people are most upset about. And it's good, what Josie Osborne is doing, and it's good. They opened a few beds in the pretrial. Is that what you're talking about?
Right.
I've heard the criticism. Oh, why are we doing treatment for people who are incarcerated? We should start with voluntary care. But you know what? The public wants to help the people on the street. They want to help the people in Pandora and the people in downtown East Side and the people in Kamloops and Terrace. Terrace has got a terrible problem. And they have no treatment. There's no treatment, no treatment and recovery, residential treatment and recovery beds for adults anywhere in the north. Not one bed. So there's a huge deficit. There's a huge gap there. They keep talking about building the continuum of care, but it's a long process, and I don't see a plan, frankly. But in terms of the
in interior communities, Fran, where this issue hits, my assumption is that it hits First Nations disproportionately higher, much higher, disproportionately. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I would say so, but I would say that yes, because they generally, like if you have a community of 200, you're not going to have hardly any services, and you even have to go to the non-Indigenous communities for the services for the hospital even. But all those communities like Smithers, it's just like they're getting inundated. They don't have any services, and the community that steps up to help in these places are just so burdened, and it's business owners, and there seems to be a bit of a dismissal of the burden on businesses, that's for sure. And that as if by saying, well, I don't want to have my business broken into 17 times in 6 months, that somehow you're being not empathetic to the poor people that are on the street. And that's the opposite. People want them dealt with. But anyways, back to your point, the mandatory care, that's good. It's a good start. We need people. It's a great place to help people when they're incarcerated. I mean, honestly, and those are the people that government should be trying to help right away, because they're the ones in most desperate need that are causing all this public safety issues in the downtowns. And they're the most deeply addicted, from what I can tell, talking to addictions experts. But we need more of it. And I mean, I haven't talked to a mayor who is not in favor of mandatory care. One, I haven't talked to a chief. I had a hard time finding any chiefs that were in favor of decriminalization or safe supply, particularly when safe supply turned up in their reserves in their land, like the YYK up in near Chief Ronnie Chikite was just like stunned. There's a big drug bust up there near Camel River. So they don't want it in their communities. Like, no one wants it in their communities. No one. Everyone wants to help, and no one wants it. And there definitely is the impression that government is not moving fast enough. They just aren't.
No.
It's complex though. It is.
It is. And it's also been hard on the Conservatives. So maybe while we've still got some time, let's turn to the Conservatives and how the session went for them, because I think you've outlined pretty well, Fran, how difficult it was in lots of ways for the NDP with all these issues. But we have a clip, which I'll try to quickly summarize from Vaughn Palmer. Clip of the week, yeah.
Should be Vaughn.
And Vaughn Palmer gave pretty positive reviews to newcomer MLAs Claire Rattay of Terrace and Conservative House Leader Alia Warbus of Chilliwack, who's been a guest on this program, both for their interventions on the drug crisis. And there was a debate where people spoke directly about it, and it's been a divisive issue inside the Conservative caucus for lots of reasons. He was less enthusiastic about our guest last week, who was Langley MLA Harman Bangu, for his attention-seeking behavior, which we won't spend too much time on, but you can go and read the clip. Here's what I wanted to focus on, though, today. He said they generally did, the Conservatives, a pretty good job of holding the government to account, but, quote, they struggled with the second job, which was presenting their party as united and ready to govern. The session was less than a month old when the opposition caucus split wide open. Rustad expelled Dallas Brody, the party's lone MLA from Vancouver, over her provocative comments on residential schools. MLAs Tara Armstrong and Jordan Keeley joined Brody in protest to sit as independents. The trio of independents has so far proven to be more effective critics of their former party than the NDP government. They ended the session by accusing Rustad of spending $100,000 in party funds to recruit a bloc of South Asian voters to pack the Conservative convention early this year. They presented no evidence of their insinuations, nor was it the first time that a BC political party was accused of recruitment shenanigans in the South Asian community. Yet it raises the question of what's next for the three independents. If they form a party, they would vault past the Greens into third place in the House, and all that entails in financial resources, staffing, and access to daily question period. Not a happy Conservative prospect for the Conservatives, but one that would surely gratify the New Democrats. So who wants to start? How do the Conservatives do at the end of the line?
I'll start. Then
start,
Fran
Mike?
can correct me. Well, I agree with Vaughn that I think the Conservatives did have a pretty good session from the standpoint of holding the government to account. I think they got a fair amount of question period stories into the media mix. And I think, this is their first session together.
Yeah.
And, I've just anecdotally, and we heard from Harman Bangu last week about this, that they're kind of, getting to know each other, starting to figure out those working relationships. A few guiding hands, but not many that have been in the legislature before. So a lot of newbies to bring along. So I can only relate this to 1991 and what I saw firsthand when I was a young cub in the legislature. I actually, in that session, was a legislative intern working for the Socreds, which I was assigned to, but long story, by my professor. But and I was working for the wizened old hands and the Socreds, watching these BC Liberal rookies stumble about. And I would say the BC Conservatives of 2025 did a much better job than the BC Liberals of 1991. So to the second point, though, are these guys a government in waiting? I don't think that's the test they need to pass today. I think they have to demonstrate that over time. And I don't, I don't expect them to succeed in that anytime soon, frankly, because they've got a lot of grown-up decisions they need to make, like their policy worldview, which I have no idea how they're going to balance a budget any more than I know how David Eby's going to balance a budget. Like they haven't really reckoned with the tough choices in the Conservative caucus, and they may think they've got time to do that. But so work in progress, I would say.
Yeah. Fran?
I can't disagree with anything that you said, Mike or Vaughn.
Oh, please do. Please do.
I agree. It's not a test they need to pass today. I also agree that they were quite an effective opposition. In terms of holding the government to account, they actually, going back to the crazy election, they certainly pulled the NDP into a bunch of different directions policy-wise, and they kind of continued that. And over the session, I think they were quite instrumental, obviously, in getting them to pull the Safe Supply program and go to witnessed, which was monumental policy change. We had one Conservative MLA. She actually got her private members bill passed, which is pretty rare. And then two others who the NDP actually just adopted their bills, the intent of their bills as policy. Now, whether that was just smart strategically, but whatever it was, I thought it was also a good move on the part of the government to actually they always say, "Oh, we're listening. If you have a good idea across the aisle, then we'll adopt it." But they did in a couple of cases, so good for them. And I think they have some really good, effective speakers and legislators. Of course, the incumbents, the incumbent BC United, Eleanor Sturko, Trevor Halford, Peter Millibar is great. Ian Patton had a great exchange. He's the agricultural critic, and he had a great exchange with Lana Poppin. It was one of the more intelligent, respectful exchanges in question period, which I love to see. It's very exciting.
I thought Larry
and-
Neufeld did a pretty good job in natural gas on the energy
Yeah,
estimates.
yes.
I mean, there's some
Yeah.
good work done in estimates debate, actually.
Yes, and of course, Scott McGinnis is also interesting. He's a different voice, and he's eloquent. Kyle Giddens up in Prince George actually helped a company up there and got the government to help the company, the renewables biodiesel refinery. And then also Alia Warbus and Claire Rattay, who really just, they were like, Claire is like this young 30-something young woman with just an arresting kind of presence. We also had her on the podcast. You may want to listen to that too. And she just like first question period of the Conservatives' their first session, and she's like a brand new member, and she just like was just like, whoa, everyone's just, and she actually, the first time ever, never seen it done, she had the last word with a premier in question period because she asked him a question, stunned everyone by saying her thing is addictions and mental health, and she stunned everyone by saying, "Oh yeah, and by the way, I lived on the streets. I was homeless. I was an addict in downtown East Side." And so she asked a question. Evie kind of blew her off, didn't take her seriously, and why would anyone? She's young. And he kind of used it to get his message out, because he had just gotten the police chief had just said, "Oh, we agree with going to witness supply." So he didn't even answer her question.
So she's kind of an example of an MLA that's a conservative MLA that's against type.
Yeah.
Yes. But then he didn't answer her question. He didn't really take her seriously. And then she stood up and she just said, "That's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to people that have died, that the people that are gonna die, like boom." And then she sat down. She didn't ask another question. And we're all like, whoa, because she's intense. She's super intense. But she's very sincere. And so like everyone on all sides of the house, they're just like, whenever she stands up, people listen.
Well,
she's interesting.
More to come with those guys, I guess, to keep an eye on.
Like you said, very, very against type. And so is Alia Warbus. I had her on and I was like, "Why are you a conservative? I don't," and she laughed. She's like, "Yeah, I know. It's surprising, but and I don't necessarily agree with everything, but it was John. She liked John Rusted. They connected. There was enough things that the Conservatives were doing policy-wise that she agreed with. And her big thing is addictions and mental health. There's not enough being done on that file. And so there's a lot of people that went to the Conservatives, I think, because of that file. Anyways, in her case, she said, there's things that we don't agree on, and I think we can imagine what they might be, certainly related to DRIPA and land use and title and all that. But she said, "You know what, we're going to cross it when we get there." And which I thought, that's pretty good. That's interesting for politics. Right up there with Rusted saying, "I'm going to allow free votes and free discussions." And it's like, everyone's like, "Oh, how's that going to work?" And we're seeing how it worked. They had 3 MLAs that split, but I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting political experiment.
The NDP had trouble executing on the bills that it said were very important. So there was a bill 5 or 7, I can never remember the numbers, but had
7.
4 sections to respond to the Trump attacks. But the 4th one just dropped away, which has to be given. The Conservatives have to have some credit for that, because initially everybody went, "Oh, okay, if it's that serious, we better go for it." Second, they did less issue with Bill 14, which was about renewable energy, because I think people thought, okay, there's already Indigenous investment, it's green power. That's not so critical. Adrian Dix had a less rough ride on that. But the last bill, as you've said, Fran, was very problematic, and they had to use all the tools in their toolbox procedurally to get it passed at the end. And there were other issues that the Conservatives were able to exploit, like the Michael Bryant one, the hiring of people, and so on. So it was kind of a ragged time, but I think that maybe the best thing that happened to Rustad was the split, because he now has three people who can say he can point to and say, well, they are very wacky implicitly, but look at these people that I have who are surprisingly approachable and interesting: Claire Rattay, Elia Warbus. I think Eleanor Sturko lost some headway during the session too, because she was fighting with her own colleagues about stuff like harm reduction. Like, she challenged Claire Rattay about why she would go down to the downtown east side, which was kind of, leading with your chin as far as I was concerned. But I think, yeah, by and large,
she's the one that leaked the safe supply internal government documents. So I would say she's still on her game. She's maybe has to find her footing with the new members, but
yeah, fair point.
And there's someone that has had to
But the one
push
thing I'll say,
herself
though,
down to get along.
the conservative side, it may be a little messy sometimes when it spills out into the media, but I think it's fair to say that they've got some energy. Like they're new, first term MLAs are really into it usually. And it'd be a challenge for Rustad to channel it, but it's usually a good sign for a party when you've got energy.
It's a nice problem to have. Yeah.
Yeah, and over time they'll go through the maturity phase. And
let me ask you. I'd like to ask both of you a question. For Bill 14 and 15, the Premier made it a confidence vote. So you both worked for premiers. So why would you do that? Would you do that?
I lost confidence votes on my part, but
but
anyways.
Was that like to force all his caucus? Was he getting some dissent, do you think?
Well, I think he was trying to drag. I think he was trying to drag the Greens in, even though these weren't part of the deal. And also, he couldn't afford to drift. Like, the Greens and everybody else were saying, let's put this off to the fall to discuss further. How can there be an emergency over construction of the Cowichan Hospital between now and then? You've had Brad West on, and Brad West had a school burned to the ground, and it's, I think, 2 years ago, and it's still in process. It seems, his indignation is kind of understandable. We don't need to decide very much about whether or not we're going to replace a school that burned to the ground. Yeah, we're going to do it as fast as we can. And yet there's still apparently a lot of processes and hoops to go through and business plans to have and so on. You would logically look and see, well, are there any needs that we should consider now just to put in while we're building? But yeah, it was, I think, a tough session for the New Democrats.
But on the confidence vote, question though, Geoff, like, forcing the confidence vote is as much a signal to your own team that, okay, you may not like it, but we're all going to go out there united and vote for it.
Yeah,
you got Joan Phillip. Joan Phillip voting for it, and her, Stuart Phillip, very noticeable on the side, on the outside, opposing it, and she went in there and voted for it.
Well, it seemed to be a hammer to
was a hammer, yeah.
Yeah, but
maybe
I couldn't see I couldn't see the nail that was sticking up. I hadn't seen any sign of division on that front.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, maybe that was something. Maybe they needed to show that. Maybe they needed to show that everyone was united to the outside world, right?
Well, let's raise a glass to the two main parties. It's
Are we going to the minibar now, Geoff?
Did we explain the minibar to you, Fran? Are you ready for a minibar?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, if so, then why don't you lead off? Are you prepared to toast or take a shot at anybody today?
Well, yeah, I was like conflicted on who we should toast. Are you suggesting the toast, or am I supposed to come up with the toast?
You go ahead.
I
put you
on the spot.
You do whatever you want.
I was thinking Canada because we're a little ways off, but then I remembered my husband just got me this, and I'm a writer, obviously, and it's delicious.
Says writer's tears.
Writer's tears. It's Irish whiskey. And I was like, oh, that's, usually if it's got a great name, maybe it doesn't taste good, but it's so good. So I thought that I only put a little bit in because it is a bit early.
You're actually
and I've been
toasting.
smelling
this is
whiskey all through the podcast. But I thought I would toast writers and podcasters and everyone out there who is trying to bring, information and enrich the public discussion on these complicated issues. So
Oh, very
toast to
good.
you.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Cheers. Clink.
Pretty
Where's
hard
yours,
act to
Geoff?
follow. Mine?
Oh, sorry.
Well, Fran, you're the first one who's brought this to the literal level, being a writer. We're usually much looser with this, but I'm also going to raise a glass to the Prime Minister, Carney, because I saw a LinkedIn post from a professor this week, Alex Marland, who writes a lot about what goes on inside political parties and in the sausage factory. And he made the point that the Prime Minister has decided that there'd be no staff attending caucus meetings.
Oh.
And this is
How is
interesting.
that going to work? Holy smoke.
How could it possibly work?
no-
How could we're going to leave these elected people all by themselves? Oh my God. I happen to support this. My view as a staff person is that caucus room should be a special place for elected people where particularly backbench MLAs feel completely unencumbered to say what they need to say, and that they feel very special in that room where everyone's an equal. And I know that in my experience over the years, I've seen it wax and wane in terms of how much staff will attend from my party in caucus room. I tried to when I came in a senior role, I tried to bring the number down to as low as I could, and got a lot of static from other staff saying, like, how are we going to know what's going on? Like, there's so much that comes out of a caucus meeting we need to come to grips with. And that's a fair comment. Mm-hmm. But I do think, though, that elected MLAs, particularly the backbench MLAs, need to flex their muscles in caucus and that's a very important safety valve for a government to have that candid conversation. And when it's suppressed by a perception of executive control, it's usually a bad thing. So I say, good for you, Prime Minister, for setting a tone early that your caucus is the most important group to you, not the PMO officials you're bringing in the room with you.
Mm-hmm. Which was an issue with his predecessor, so doubly so.
It can inflate over time, too, because everyone wants to be in that room.
Yeah.
Well, just in terms of flexing, I'll raise a glass to Sukh Dhaliwal, the Liberal MP from Surrey, who exploded in concern when Mark Carney invited Narendra Modi to come to the G7. It is interesting watching the Prime Minister do various things, including kick staff out of caucus. And inviting Modi was a bold move. And Sukh Dhaliwal immediately channeled his constituents to say it was a terrible idea and that this guy was a murderer of Mr. Nijjar, of course, the killing that occurred a couple of years ago in Surrey at the temple of a Khalistani activist. So I think, good for Sukh for speaking up so quickly. It won't endear him necessarily to anybody in the Prime Minister's office, but and I don't disagree with what the Prime Minister did, by the way, because I don't think you can have such terrible relations with India as we were having. You can certainly not condone any of the actions that were alleged by Trudeau, but I think we're finding a different balance here, which may be good for us. But anyway, good for Sukh for speaking up for his BC constituents in that case. Whether he prevails, I don't think he will, but it was an interesting exchange.
Democracy.
Yeah. Voice raised against the Prime Minister. Probably a career-limiting move, but I'm not sure how much further Sukh's career was going anyway.
Right.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us, Fran. And to Sean Holman for checking in earlier. And to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, Fortis BC, and the Health Sciences Association of British Columbia. See you next week, BC. You can never leave.